Both of today's stories are about people who made big choices that they thought would improve their lives. But neither of them really took the time to actually learn exactly what they were signing up for. And that led to disaster. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please gift the follow button a brand new gumball machine. But don't tell them the gum is actually just painted balls of candle wax. Okay, let's get into our first story called Dream Car. At 8 a.m. on June 8, 2015, 72-year-old James Lee Rogers parked his beautiful red Corvette in the parking lot of a Waffle House in Port Arthur, Texas. And as he pulled that car into the lot, James, he just felt so proud to be driving this vehicle. This was a 2007 C6 Chevy Corvette, pristine condition, and it was exactly the car that James had been dreaming about like his whole life. It drove amazing, it looked incredible, and more than that, it had all these modern elements to it. It didn't even have regular door handles. Everything was like push buttons and electric. To him, owning this car was like owning a really flashy sports car, and he thought that, anybody who saw him driving it, they knew this guy had made it. And on top of having this really cool car, James also had like a pretty awesome life here in Port Arthur. He had lots of family in the area. He had grown up here. He loved living here, but he also really loved this particular Waffle House. It was where he went basically every morning in his flashy car to get his coffee. But, it wasn't just their coffee that he was drawn to. It was the wait staff. It was the regulars who went to this Waffle House. This had become like a sort of second home for him, and he really looked forward to coming here basically every day. And so he parks his Corvette, he gets out, and before he walks into the restaurant, he has to tell his dog, he brought his dog along, Leia, this cute little dog, to stay in the car because the dog was not allowed in the Waffle House. This was something he knew, but it was going to be quick. So he told Leia, to be a good girl and stay in the car. Don't rip it up. This is his dream car. She was a very good dog. And so she sat down. He shut the doors, used the electric push buttons to do it. And then once he knew his dog was secure, into the restaurant he went. Once he got inside, James took his usual seat at the counter where his friend MJ was already sitting. MJ was in his 60s, and like James, he was also a fixture at this Waffle House. And so the two immediately began chit-chatting about the weather and their kids. And then at some point, James ordered his coffee and used that as a chance to catch up with some of the wait staff that he spoke to every morning. And then eventually more regulars began filtering in and out, and James made a point to chat with them and laugh with them as well. Again, this was like his second home. And in fact, on this particular day, there were so many people that he wanted to talk to coming in and out of the restaurant that he decided, my dog's fine out there. I've only been in here for a few minutes. I'm going to order some food as well. However, right after James ordered his food, he turned and he looked out the window into the parking lot. And even though he couldn't actually see his Corvette, he could see that it was extremely sunny and very hot outside. Like he knew that when he showed up, but he's looking out there and it just looks like a desert out there. It's so hot and like there's nobody out there. It's just cars getting blasted by the sun. And he's thinking like Leia's out there. And even though he had the AC on when he pulled up, and so, likely his Corvette was still a little bit cool, there was no way that it was particularly comfortable in his car right now. And so before his food showed up, James turned to MJ and just said, "Hey, I'm going to be right back. You want to just like hold my seat? I'm going to go out and check on something." And MJ, who was kind of busy talking to other people, he's like, "Yeah, go ahead. I'll save your seat." And then James left the restaurant to go check on Leia. And so James, after leaving the Waffle House, he sort of ran around the corner out of view of where he had been sitting, and he went over to his beautiful dream car. And as soon as he walked up to the window, he could see that Leia was, very excited inside, happy to see James again. And, just for good measure, even though he now knew his dog's okay, he climbed inside the driver's seat and shut the door, and he turned around and he pet his dog and just, he could tell the temperature inside the car was not that bad. And so he was only going to be in the restaurant for another 15, 20 minutes tops. She'd be okay. However, after only having sat inside his car for a matter of maybe like 30 or 60 seconds, he felt himself getting really hot. I mean, it was definitely not cool inside the car, and the sun's burning through the windows. And he just was like, you know what? This is not responsible to leave my dog in here. I can't do this. And so even though he had placed his order for food, he figured he could go in there, cancel the order. He was a regular. They'd understand. He could have one more sip of coffee, but that was it. He needed to get back out here and basically put the AC back on and get him and his dog back into the comforts of their own home. But when James pushed that super fancy button on his car door that he was sort of so proud of how modern his vehicle was, when he pushed it to open his door, nothing happened. And so James, he's just staring at the door in confusion because this has never happened before. And so he starts pushing it a few more times. But again, nothing happened. And then after a few moments, when this car door was not budging, James reached across and started pushing the button on the passenger side door to see if maybe it was just an issue with, his door. But no, that door wouldn't open either. And so finally, he decided he would just try to turn the car on to see if maybe that would help. But he couldn't get his car to turn on. The Corvette was completely dead, and James had no idea why. But he knew this was not good because, this car, because it's so modern, didn't have normal handles. They really were all electric, all buttons. And so if these buttons aren't working and all the windows are up, what do you do? How do you get out? And so James, he's starting to stress out about what's going to happen here? Is he going to have to break a window of his beloved vehicle here? Is that what he's going to have to do? And also, how crazy is that? How could he have wound up in this position? But also, the sun is just burning through the glass, and he's suddenly becoming really aware of just how hot it was getting inside of his car. This is sort of becoming an emergency really quickly. I mean, because again, he can't even turn on the car, so he can't turn on the AC. He's inside of an oven at this point. And so James instinctively reached for where his phone would normally be, but it wasn't there. And that's when he remembered he had left his phone inside the Waffle House. When he had gone in earlier, it was low on charge and he had handed it off to one of the waitstaff to go plug in somewhere. And so his phone's inside. He has no way to contact anyone. But luckily, right at that point, James looked out the corner of his eye and he saw a couple walking out of the Waffle House. And he's like, oh, thank goodness. Someone's coming out. I can get their attention. They can come over here and get me out of here. Or at least, call someone who can. And so he starts waving, through the front windshield at this couple as they're sort of walking generally in his direction, but they clearly didn't see him. The sun is glaring off the glass, kind of making it hard to see inside. And so James is sort of realizing this, and he's becoming more and more desperate as he and his dog are getting more and more overheated. And so he began leaning on the horn to get their attention that way, but no sound came out of his Corvette because the horn was powered by electricity, and again, the car is dead. And so James now is getting frantic. He's banging on the windows. He's screaming to them. But this is a nice car. It's totally soundproof inside. Again, there's the glare from the sun on the glass. The windows are partially tinted. They can't see or hear him. And so this couple eventually comes right near his vehicle. They climb in their car and they drive away without ever noticing him. Once they were gone, James told himself that, you know what? This is a busy area. Lots of people come in and out of this Waffle House. Someone's going to see us. Someone's going to get us out of this car. And so for the next several minutes, James looked all around him, looking for anybody walking through this parking lot, looking for people coming out of the Waffle House, and anybody who came even close to his vehicle, he would scream and yell and bang and do anything he could to get their attention. But nobody noticed him. No one could see or hear him. And now James and his dog were really starting to struggle with the heat inside of this vehicle. It really was like they were trapped inside of an oven. And so eventually, when it seemed like no one was going to notice them, James just began frantically looking around the interior of his car for a toolkit. He thought he had left a toolkit in here somewhere, in case of emergencies. And he's thinking, maybe there was a tool in there he could use to maybe jimmy open one of the doors, or if he had to, he could maybe use something heavy in the toolkit to break a window, just to get out that way. And so eventually, in the back seat near Leia, he found this toolkit, but when he cracked it open, he was disappointed because it really didn't have anything that useful. There were some pliers, there were some jumper cables, and a flashlight. But, James, he still took the pliers and he jammed the head of the pliers into the crack of the driver's side door to attempt to basically wrench open the door. But the pliers were very thin, and so he didn't budge the door at all. And he used a lot of energy trying to, force the door open. And remember, it's like blisteringly hot inside of the vehicle at this point, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe. Like Leah's struggling to breathe. James is, drenched in sweat, and so he drops the pliers, and he just has this huge wave of anxiety come over him that like, oh my goodness, like, is this it? Are we going to die in here? And so as like this crushing reality is coming down on him, James has this adrenaline surge, and he leans back in his seat and he starts kicking as hard as he can against the glass with his feet to try to break open the windshield or kick open the driver's side window. But amazingly, despite all of his energy going into this, he didn't crack the window at all. Like it felt like he was kicking a concrete wall. There was no budge, nothing. And so again, after exerting even more energy and now sweating even more, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe, James took those pliers and he's really gassed. He can barely breathe, and he starts smashing the head of the pliers into the window. That didn't do anything. So it's like, I can't do anything to get out of this vehicle. And so James, he sort of just like lays back in the driver's seat, which he had reclined at this point, and he's panting. He can barely breathe. He's opened up his shirt a little bit, and he's looking back at his dog, and she's really struggling, and he's just like, I can't believe this is happening. And as he's laying there, he sort of looks towards the front of the car, and his eyes land on the glove box in front of the passenger seat. And it was like, oh my goodness, how could I forget? There's a manual inside of there. There has got to be instructions for what to do if your car dies. There's got to be a way to get out. Like, it's got to be in that manual. And so suddenly, having all this energy, James sat up, he opened up the glove box, and he pulled out this manual that he had never read before. I mean, he had no reason to, but he opened it up and he began looking through it, looking for, the section that would explain what to do in case of, total power outage and you're stuck inside the vehicle. But like, as he's looking at the pages, like his vision's swimming, it's so hot. He's so tired, and it's all this little text. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages, and like nothing explained the situation. It was like so not user-friendly. And so James, he's flipping through all these pages, and even just the act of turning the page was becoming so laborious. Like, he is just beginning to shut down. I mean, he's basically dying inside of an oven, and he can barely turn the page. And then before long, after about a quarter of the way through, it's like he couldn't see anymore, and he literally just like he couldn't turn the page anymore. He had no strength left. MJ, so James's buddy, the guy in his 60s who was also a regular at the Waffle House, he's inside the Waffle House. He's having his breakfast and his coffee. He knew James had stepped out. He was going to be right back, and he did not come right back. But he figured no big deal. Like, he probably got caught up with something. Maybe he forgot that he had ordered food. But, MJ, he's got all these reasons for why James has not come back to the restaurant. And also, MJ, being a regular, he's chatting it up with other people. He's not really even aware of the fact that James has not come back inside the Waffle House. And eventually, after MJ had had his coffee and his food, he's getting ready to maybe make an exit himself when two employees come running in the front door of the Waffle House. And so everybody turns to these employees who clearly are sort of making a scene here. And they're like, what's going on? And the employees, they're like, we just saw James. He's asleep in his car, and we can't open the doors. We slammed on the windows, but he's not reacting. At this point, MJ felt sick to his stomach because he suddenly realized when he looked at his watch, it had been 4 hours since James had gone outside saying he'd be right back. Now, MJ, he got caught up doing other things, and he was in here all the time. He loved being here. Time flew when he was in here. But even he, didn't understand how much time had passed. And he's thinking oh my gosh, what's happened to James? And so MJ jumps out of his seat, and he runs outside into the blistering heat. He goes around the corner to the red Corvette. He sees, through the tinted glass, there's James inside of the vehicle. He starts hitting on the window, but there's no answer. James isn't moving. And so MJ calls 911. It would turn out when James bought the red Corvette, I mean, it really was like his dream car. He fell in love with it. I mean, it was beautiful. It was flashy. It oozed status. It had all this new tech. It looked so expensive. I mean, it was perfect. And James, I mean, he didn't just, buy this car and that was it. I mean, after he had it, he obsessed over it. He learned every little detail about it. He took great care of it. He drove it everywhere. I mean, this was like his child. But despite, really obsessing over the car, he never learned one really important thing about this car, which is, what do you do if you happen to be inside of the vehicle with the windows rolled up and your power goes out? Because the doors are not regular doors. They're powered by buttons. They're electrical. And if you have no power, you can't open them, as he found. Well, it turns out there's actually a lever under the driver's seat that once you pull it up, it pops open the driver's side door and you can get out, no matter if there's electricity or not. But that information was buried on page 80 of that owner's manual that he had pulled out and begun flipping through, but he was so delirious from heat exhaustion, he couldn't get that far into the manual. He's like combing through all this really dense text. He made it about a quarter of the way through when unfortunately he and his dog Leia died from heat exhaustion. James's family filed a wrongful death case with Chevrolet, the maker of the Corvette, in 2018, but the case was dismissed. Chevrolet still makes Corvettes with these special electric doors, and there have been numerous additional incidents of people getting locked in and trapped. But in more recent Corvette models, the manuals have the information about the door's release lever much closer to the front of the manual. On August 20th, 1862, a 17-year-old farmhand named Jean Leroux carried his axe over to a stack of logs by a barn on a farm in Ottawa Township, Minnesota. As a farmhand, Jean was responsible for lots of different odd jobs, like splitting the firewood and feeding the animals and helping with the crops. Basically, Jean had to know every single inch of the farm and the woods that surrounded it and how to take care of it all. But even though he was basically constantly busy, Jean still found his mind wandering to a place that was sort of difficult, which was he felt a lot of times pretty homesick. So Jean was actually from France, and he had left behind his whole family and his, previous life to come here to America, where there was supposed to be more opportunity. However, America was turning out to be a pretty violent place. The country was currently fighting the Civil War. And on top of that, the area specifically where Jean lived was pretty much like the frontier. And so there were these constant territorial disputes and virtually no law enforcement. So just a really dangerous place. But more than any dangers he faced, Jean just really missed his family, especially his mom. So he spent basically every spare minute he had, which was, few and far between, sitting out in the woods by this one particular just huge, beautiful oak tree. And he would sit at the base of it and he would make journal entries about basically everything he was doing so he could track it all and know what to tell his mom when he finally got to see her again. He just wanted to tell her all about his experience. Also, just for context, Jean had saved virtually all the money he had worked so hard to acquire, and his whole plan was to eventually send that money to his mother, who he loved so very much and missed so much. But more and more, the more homesick he became, the more he wished he could actually just go back to France and get out of America and literally hand the money to his mom and just see her again and be done with this whole America experiment. But for now, Jean raised his axe over his head and he brought it down on the log that he was going to split. And it did. It split open. And he raised the axe again to chop another log. But as he did, he froze because off in the distance, he could hear a series of repetitive booming noises, really loud. And for Jean, immediately his heart started to race and he was so scared because he knew what those were. Those were gunshots. And he was terrified that the thing that he and really everybody else in his town had been scared of for days was now finally happening. So right on the other side of the woods that surrounded the farm was the Minnesota River. And over the last decade, lots of people had settled along this river. And there'd been a town established right nearby, and new homes were being built constantly. However, all the expansion had literally forced out the indigenous tribe who had previously lived in the area, the Sioux. And after being displaced, the Sioux had struggled to find food and a place to live while the settlers just continued to expand and take more of their land. So finally, just 2 days earlier, the Sioux had had enough, and they finally retaliated, attacking settlements along that river. It was being called the Sioux Uprising, and the attacks so far had been horrific. A lot of farms along that river had been burned to the ground, and their occupants had been killed right alongside it. And then just yesterday, the Sioux had attacked a city that was just 50 miles down the river from where Jean was right now. And so Jean and everybody else in this particular area had really been terrified the last 24 hours that the violence was moving in their direction towards Ottawa Township. And so now Jean, he had put his axe down and he just stood there, trembling as the sound of gunshots continued. I mean, this was not just a few stray bullets. This was a barrage of gunfire. And so this could only mean one thing. The Sioux were here. Now, Jean couldn't tell exactly where the shooting was coming from, but he could tell it was pretty close. And so Jean knew that he likely only had maybe several minutes to gather up whatever he could of his possessions and get to safety before the Sioux arrived. So Jean, he bolts over to the farmhouse, goes inside, and he goes to the area inside where he slept, and he grabbed his rifle, and he also grabbed his notebook and all that cash he'd been saving for his mom. And he jammed the notebook and the cash into a satchel, and with his rifle over his shoulder, he ran back outside. And then once he was outside, he sprinted right towards the tree line at the edge of the property. And after running for a little while, Jean finally stopped to catch his breath and to listen to see if there was more gunfire. And as he sat there listening, he couldn't hear anything. But that's when he realized, he's all alone out here. If the Sioux came charging through the trees right now, he wouldn't stand a chance, even with his rifle. But Jean had an advantage. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. He was in here all the time. And because of that, he knew exactly where to go to find safety. About an hour later, Jean's boss and the owner of the farm, Edward Gleek, hustled from his farmhouse towards town. Mr. Gleek had also heard the gunshots. Basically everybody in town had. And he had come running out of the barn just in time to see his farmhand, Jean Leroux, bolting off into the woods. And, Mr. Gleek, he didn't blame the kid. He was also horrified by the recent attacks and was also very worried that those shots they were hearing were a sign that trouble had finally arrived in their town. But after all these gunshots, no Sioux warriors showed up in town. And so now Mr. Gleek was heading to the town center to see what had actually happened. What were those gunshots? Now, Mr. Gleek had sort of accepted that this could have been something totally benign, or it could have been the Sioux. He didn't know. But he was just going to find out. He was rational. He was calm, despite, the risks here. But when he got into the town center, all he could see was just chaos. Many of the area's residents were out running around, carrying trunks and bags and all their belongings like they were fleeing the area, much like Mr. Gleek's farmhand, Jean Leroux, had looked like he was doing. However, it didn't take long for Mr. Gleek to hear what had happened, and it was not an attack by the Sioux. Those people running around like maniacs, fleeing the area, they just hadn't heard the real story yet. They were sort of operating like there was an attack coming. So apparently, a group of American soldiers had been riding on a boat up the Minnesota River, and for some reason, they just gotten overly excited and began firing their guns repeatedly. So those were gunshots. And unfortunately, because they were gunshots, they completely freaked out all the residents around the river because of this growing threat of the Sioux attacking. But fortunately, at least in this case, there were no attacks. This was just, an unfortunate event. And so after hearing this, Mr. Gleek went back to his farm to find Jean and tell him that, everything was actually just fine. But when he got there, Jean still had not come back yet. And when Mr. Gleek went into the woods to go look around for him, he couldn't find him. Now, Mr. Gleek figured that Jean would eventually find out what happened, much like everybody else in town. Not everyone had the news yet. And so at some point that day, he was bound to return. But by the time night fell, Jean still had not come back. And then the next day, Jean didn't come back. And the next day, and the next day, he just didn't come back. And so finally, after repeatedly searching his property and asking all over town if anybody had seen Jean, Mr. Gleek finally came to the conclusion that Jean must have fled because of this Sioux attack and then likely gone back to France to be with his mother, something he knew he wanted to do anyways. Maybe this was his excuse. 57 years later, on a morning in July of 1919, Mr. Gleek sat on his porch looking out over his farm, the same farm that Jean had been a farmhand for 57 years earlier. Mr. Gleek was old now, and so he could no longer actually physically work on the farm himself. So instead, he had to hire entire crews to do various jobs. And in fact, right now, he had a whole bunch of workers out in the woods clearing away some dead brush for him. And so as Mr. Gleek is just kind of surveying his property, he notices a worker come running out of the tree line and starts waving at Mr. Gleek really frantically, like he had something really important to say. And then as the man got closer, Mr. Gleek could see that this worker looked terrified. And before Mr. Gleek could ask what had happened, the worker, whose face was, white as a ghost, said Mr. Gleek needed to come and see something. And so Mr. Gleek, who was, very intrigued at this point, managed to haul himself up and he slowly hobbled off into the woods with this worker. And as he got to where the rest of the crew was, inside the forest, he saw that they were all mostly gathered around this very large, recently downed oak tree. And the whole group was very quiet and tense. And they were all just staring at a section of this tree that had split open. When Mr. Gleek joined the group and looked at this particular section of the trunk of this tree, this hollow part, at first he didn't even know what he was staring at. It was just this hollowed out sort of split section of the tree, and there was a few items that didn't belong there that were inside of it, like a cache of sorts. But then he sort of fixated on one particular item, and that's when he understood why the group was just so stunned. And as he stared and sort of took in what he was seeing, he suddenly became utterly horrified. It would turn out, when Jean ran off into the woods 57 years earlier, he used his intimate knowledge of the farmland and the surrounding woods to escape what he thought was a very dangerous situation. And he did that by hiding. Jean knew that oak tree where he would always go when he would write in his notebook happened to have a hollow trunk. And he figured he'd be just the right size to crawl inside of there and stay in there hidden until the Sioux were gone. And so Jean had made it to the tree, and he had wedged himself inside of there, totally out of view. And then unfortunately, he got stuck. From inside the trunk of the tree, Jean had managed to write one last letter to Mr. Gleek, saying that he couldn't get out, he was stuck. And if he did die here, to please give all his money to his mother in France. And so decades later, when Mr. Gleek's workers cut that big oak tree down, what they found inside of the hollow trunk was Jean's gun, his money, his notebook, and his mummified body. Today's podcast will feature two stories that are about events that simply couldn't have happened by chance alone. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Bleeding Out, and this story comes full circle in the most unbelievable way. And the second and final story you'll hear today is called Three Hangings, and it might be one of the strongest examples of unseen forces shaping an outcome. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to let the follow button stay in your Airbnb for free. But don't tell them about all those human-hating honey badgers you've hid under all the beds. Okay, let's get into our first story called Bleeding Out. On the afternoon of June 29, 1934, a 37-year-old police officer named Captain Alan Falby pressed the throttle on his police motorcycle and sped down a street in El Paso, Texas. Captain Falby's motorcycle lights and sirens were on because he was chasing a speeding pickup truck down the road. But despite the fact that obviously Captain Falby was in pursuit of this person, they were not slowing down at all. So Captain Falby had been a police officer for 11 years, and he loved his job, he loved his motorcycle, and he hated when suspects got away. So he kept his hand on the throttle and kept chasing down the suspect, but suddenly the truck he was going after slammed on its brakes and swerved hard to the left. Falby tried to slow down, but it was too late. He slammed into the back of this truck, and then he and his bike went sliding across the asphalt for a few seconds, and the whole time, Falby is feeling his body getting totally scraped against the pavement, and the wind's getting knocked out of him. And then finally, when he came to a stop, he was splayed out in the middle of the road, and his motorcycle, his beloved motorcycle, was laying on top of him, pinning his legs under him. And this bike weighed like 500 pounds. And adding insult to injury here, as Falby is screaming out in pain because obviously horrible injuries have been sustained here, he looks down the road and he sees the truck he was chasing, who clearly knew he just wrecked behind them. They're not going to stay and help. They just drove off protecting themselves. And so pretty quickly, Falby kind of assessed the situation he was in. He tried for a second to push this bike off of him, but not only could he not move it, but every time he moved it just a little bit, the weight would kind of come down even harder and a little bit more pointed on his legs, which were crushed, and he had this excruciating pain down there. And worse, he's looking underneath him and he's seeing this growing pool of blood. Clearly, he's sustained potentially life-threatening injuries here, and he's all alone. Like, there's nobody here to help him, and he's totally stuck. And so even though he began calling out for help, the reality was, if nobody came along soon, he was done for. And he found himself starting to panic. Luckily though, just then, two men from down the road came running up to Captain Falby. Apparently they had been sort of behind the captain and were watching him pursuing this truck, and they had actually seen the accident. And so they had pulled over, and they were now running up to see if he was okay. And so right away, without even needing to ask Captain Falby what he needed, these two men saw the situation. The bike is pinned on top of the cop. And so together, these two men were able to lift this heavy motorcycle off of the captain's legs. And as soon as they did, all three of them looked, and they could clearly see, the reason there's all this blood all over the pavement. There was this huge gash in Captain Falby's leg right above his knee that was just pouring out blood. And Captain Falby, he saw that, and he was already starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss, but just seeing this huge wound was totally disorienting. Fortunately, though, the two men who had arrived on the scene to help Captain Falby kept their composure. And one of them actually noticed that Captain Falby was wearing a necktie. He had a formal police uniform on that had, a necktie as part of it. And he gently reached over and he told Captain Falby to relax, and he undid his necktie. Meanwhile, the other man, he ran over to the side of the road where this big tree was, and he got a stick, a pretty sturdy stick. And so the guy who undid the necktie, he tied it around Captain Falby's leg above the wound, basically cutting off circulation to that wound, a tourniquet. He tied it off, and then the other guy came back over with the stick, and he handed it to the guy with the necktie, and he took the stick and threaded it carefully through the necktie that was now wrapped around the captain's leg, and he began twisting the stick, wrapping up the fabric as he twisted it, which in turn mechanically tightened that tourniquet around the captain's leg, much tighter than you could do, without something mechanical. Like, this is somebody who clearly knew how to make a real tourniquet out of sort of everyday materials. And so they tie off the super tight tourniquet, they stop the bleeding, and it ultimately saves Captain Falby's life. In fact, by the time Captain Falby actually got brought to the hospital and they took off this DIY tourniquet and patched him up for real, the doctor would tell Captain Falby that, he was about 10 minutes away from death from blood loss. So had it not been for those two guys who showed up and made that tourniquet, he very likely would have died. 4 years later, on December 12th, 1938, Captain Falby was back at work. And he had been, ever since maybe 6 months after his injury. He had just gone back to work, fully recovered. He did have some scar tissue on his leg, but he was basically back to full capacity. And so on this particular day, Captain Falby was on patrol like he normally was in El Paso when he got a call over the radio about a bad car accident that had happened out on Route 80, which is a major road in that town. And so Captain Falby races over to the scene, and he sees there's this car that's clearly veered off the road and smashed into a tree, and the driver, or who appears to be the driver, is sitting still in the driver's seat, and they were unconscious. And so Falby was the first on the scene. He pulls over, he gets off his bike, he rushes over to the car, and he carefully pulls this unconscious man out of the car, and he lays him on the ground, and he sees this guy has a horrible gash in his leg, and it's bleeding profusely. But because this basically mirrored the exact same type of injury that Falby himself had had 4 years earlier when he crashed his motorcycle, Falby knew what to do. He didn't have, a issued tourniquet on hand, but he knew how to make one. He had a necktie, and there were sticks on the side of the road. So as quick as he could, he rushed over, grabbed a sturdy stick, took off his necktie, tied it around this man's leg, used the stick to tighten it up even further, and he cut off the bleeding to that wound. And so at this point, now that Captain Falby has realized that, okay, this guy appears to be stable now, he's not actively bleeding, he's clearly still breathing, albeit unconscious, but, it seems like he has a fighting chance here. And so he's waiting for paramedics to show up and take this guy to the hospital, and he's just sitting there sort of, happy he was able to be here and save this guy, when he sort of looks at this guy and he realizes something. The man he had just saved with his DIY tourniquet was literally the actual same guy who had saved Captain Falby with a DIY tourniquet 4 years earlier. Captain Falby had never even gotten the guy's name. They had not stayed in touch after his accident. They had gone separate ways. But now he's looking down at this man and he's realizing it's the same one. The guy's name was Alfred Smith, and he would make a full recovery. But when he was rushed to the hospital, they would say, you were within about maybe 10 minutes of bleeding to death had it not been for Captain Falby. So literally, this DIY tourniquet story played out almost exactly the same way with these two guys doing it to each other, but 4 years apart. Later on, Captain Falby and Alfred Smith would give an interview to Ripley's Believe It or Not, a TV show, to talk about the incredible coincidence that saved both their lives. And when the interviewer at some point congratulated Captain Falby on his heroic efforts, Falby simply stated, quote, "One good tourniquet deserves another."
You see, Alfred Smith was the man who put the tourniquet around my leg and saved my life when my motorcycle hit that truck. After all, one good tourniquet deserves another.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen.
Late on the evening of November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Lee helped his sister Elizabeth clear the dining room table in the English manor where they both worked. John was a butler at this manor, and his sister Elizabeth was a cook. And the manor itself had a name. It was called the Glen, and it was this gorgeous property right on the beach in the seaside community in England. Now, years ago, the Glen had been much more grand, and in fact, the King and Queen of England had at one point came to stay at the Glen. But recently, the Glen and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The staff was down to a skeleton crew of just John, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids, which meant virtually all the physical labor at this property fell to John to take care of. So, on this night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china in his arms to bring out to the kitchen, and as he was doing this, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also kind of helping clear the table, about an upcoming dinner party they were going to host at the Glen for some very important lawyers and politicians. But as John tried to talk to Elizabeth, Elizabeth just wasn't really reacting. She was kind of staring off into space, and she was only carrying 1 or maybe 2 plates off the dining room table, while John is carrying like 50. And so John was becoming really annoyed with his sister. I mean, she's not really helping, and she's ignoring him. And so John was about to complain to his sister about her behavior when suddenly she turned around and she apologized to him and said, "You know what? I'm sorry I'm acting this way. I just don't feel very good, and I really think I should go lie down." Now, John was about to be really annoyed at this, but then he noticed his sister had her hands kind of reflexively over her stomach. And John knew his sister was pregnant, and so suddenly he felt like, okay, the reason she's acting this way must be because of her pregnancy. And so he did not press the issue. Now, you need to understand that Elizabeth did not tell John that she was pregnant, nor did she tell anybody else in the house. Because the owners of the Glen were very traditional and very religious, and they almost certainly would not approve of Elizabeth's pregnancy because she wasn't married. At the time in England, it was not okay to have babies out of wedlock. It was viewed as like this totally taboo thing that you should never do. But despite Elizabeth's best efforts to conceal her pregnancy, John and the other 2 elderly maids very quickly realized what was going on, because every morning they would see Elizabeth vomiting because of morning sickness. And so when they approached her and said, "Hey, it looks like you're pregnant, what's going on here?" Elizabeth refused to talk about it. She did not admit to being pregnant. She just kind of said, "Leave me alone." I mean, John didn't even know who the father was. Like, Elizabeth did not want to talk to anyone about her pregnancy. But despite all that, John and the other two maids really wanted to support Elizabeth and help her get through this pregnancy, without being found out and potentially fired because of it. So when Elizabeth said to John that she just wanted to go lie down because she was feeling sick, he didn't press the issue, and he just told her, you know what, I'm fine, I'll finish up, you go lay down, I hope you feel better. By 11 p.m., John was nearly done with all of his chores and he was getting ready for bed when one of the elderly maids came into the room and told John it was time for their nightly prayers. And without any hesitation, John put down the silverware that he was polishing and followed the maid into the living room where one of the owners of the Glen was waiting in her nightclothes. The owner was a 68-year-old woman named Emma Case, and at night she really liked to lead a nightly prayer with her staff. It was something she really enjoyed doing. Now, John was not a very religious person, but he really cared about Emma, and so he agreed to do these nightly prayers really just to make her happy. After all, Emma had basically saved him on multiple occasions. John had begun working for Emma 6 years earlier when he was just 14 years old. And John, he was kind of like a rough kid and a troublemaker, but Emma, she just had a soft spot for him. And at some point, when John admitted to Emma that he was really interested in traveling the world someday, Emma would help him get into the British Royal Navy. And for 2 years, John very happily served in the military and did get to see the world. But at the 2-year mark, John came down with this terrible case of pneumonia, and it forced him to leave the military early. And so when John was medically discharged, he came back home and he had no idea what he was going to do. He anticipated staying in the Navy for some time, not just 2 years. But luckily, Emma stepped in again, and she gave this glowing recommendation of John to one of her very wealthy friends, basically saying, hey, you should hire John. And this wealthy friend of Emma's agreed and hired John, and John was so happy, so relieved. Emma has totally picked him up again. But after getting hired, John would make a totally stupid mistake. He would steal this really expensive plate from this wealthy friend, and he would get caught. And this wealthy friend, they didn't just scold John and make him give the plate back. They got the police involved, and ultimately John would be sent to prison for 6 months for the theft. And when John got out again, he was certain nobody was going to hire him. He just went to jail for stealing. But that was when Emma, for a third time, stepped in and helped John again. Emma was a big believer in forgiving people and giving them additional chances when they screwed up. And so she said to John, you know what? I understand you made a mistake. Why don't you come back to the Glen and work for me? You can be our butler. John couldn't believe it. He knew he did not deserve this chance, especially from Emma, who's now been done wrong by him multiple times. But, he was so grateful, and he said to Emma, I'll take this, of course, and I will do anything you want. No matter what, I will do the best possible job. I'm not going to screw this up. And so far, that was exactly what John had done since coming back to the Glen. He did whatever Emma wanted, and that included nightly prayers. So on this night, after John walked into the dining room, he took a seat next to Emma at the table, and then after Elizabeth and the other 2 elderly maids took their seats at the table, they all held hands and they bowed their heads, and then Emma began to lead them in prayer. When the service was over, the 2 maids got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of hot cocoa for Emma. Emma typically stayed up really, really late, basically later than anybody else in the house, and she liked to drink hot cocoa and just sit by the fire and, read and write letters. It was just kind of her time to be alone and to be left alone. And so after the maids had gone, John stood up too, and he said goodnight to Emma and told her to enjoy the rest of her night, and then he made his way into the kitchen and he went into the pantry, which doubled as his bedroom. And once in the pantry, he pulled out his cot, climbed under the covers, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking in the kitchen, and it's just completely covered in smoke. He can barely see, but not far from him in the kitchen was his sister and also one of the maids. And they were the ones screaming. And they were actually screaming at John to wake up and go get everybody. We need to get them out of the house and get some help. And so John, his first instinct is, okay, clearly there's a fire or something. And Emma, she's upstairs and she could be in trouble. And so John, he instinctively ran towards the stairs and began going up to the second floor to save Emma. But as he went up the stairs, the other maid was coming down the stairs looking totally frantic. And she would tell John that she was just in Emma's bedroom and she couldn't see Emma anywhere and her bed was totally on fire. And so she didn't know if Emma was even in there, but it didn't look good. And so John, at this point, he turned and went with that maid back to the kitchen where they linked up with John's sister and that other maid. And the four of them filled up buckets of water and tried to run back up the stairs to attempt to put out the fire that was in Emma's bedroom. But by the time they got back upstairs, the fire up there had really spread and there was like a wall of fire right in front of Emma's bedroom. So there was no way to really get through it, and their little buckets of water did nothing. And so even though they hated the idea of leaving Emma potentially behind, the four of them knew they couldn't do anything more. And so finally, the four of them turned and began running downstairs to evacuate. And as they ran through the dining room on the first floor, they would find Emma. She was laying on the ground, sprawled out, and it was obvious to all four of them that she was clearly dead. However, it was also obvious that the fire had not killed her. She had clearly been hacked to death. She had all these horrible wounds on her head that looked like somebody had taken an axe basically to her head, and her neck was so deeply cut, it was almost like someone tried to remove her head. John and Elizabeth and the two maids just stood there staring in shock at Emma, not even sure what to do, and then one of the maids just started screaming, and then all four of them just turned and ran out of the house. Eventually, some neighbors, some local fishermen, and members of the Coast Guard were able to put out the fire at the Glen. But this was not just a fire, this was a murder. And so when police came to investigate, suspicion immediately fell on John. This was back in the day, well before forensic science was used in investigations. And so at the time, the way police kind of figured out who done it is by intuition and gut feeling and assumptions. I mean, it was basically like pseudoscience. But at the time, that's how it was. And quickly, the police determined that whoever had killed Emma and inflicted these horrible injuries on her, they had to be really strong. And so the assumption was, John is the only man in the house, and so very likely the strongest person in the house. And so he must have been the one to do this, because it didn't look like anybody else had the strength to do this. Also, the investigators found these blood trails underneath the rubble from the fire that showed Emma had not actually been murdered where she was found on the ground in the dining room. Instead, she had actually been killed in the hallway near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And basically right outside of John's pantry door was a bloody hatchet and a bloody knife. And on top of all of that, investigators also determined that the fire had been set intentionally, and the person who set it had used this particular type of oil that was very flammable, and they had doused it all over the house and ignited it. And it turned out the only place where this oil was located inside of the Glen was inside of the pantry where John slept. So, on the same day this whole fire breaks out and they find Emma dead, John was arrested for Emma's murder. The next day, John was in his jail cell, and a guard came down the hall and rapped on the bars and told John he had a visitor. His lawyer was here to talk to him. But John was confused because he didn't have a lawyer, so he had no idea who this was. But regardless, the guard opened up the cell, and he led John down the hallway to this room, and when John walked in, he saw there was this man who was very well dressed and very handsome. He was sitting at this table, and clearly he was waiting for John. And John, at first he didn't really know who this guy was, but then it dawned on him that he knows who this guy is, and it made no sense that he was here to defend John. The man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer, highly respected in the area, and he also happened to be one of Emma's absolute closest friends. So Reginald Templar, Emma's close friend, the woman who's been murdered, is here to defend the person who's accused of killing Emma? It just didn't make any sense. But eventually, Reginald gestured for John to come in the room and sit down. And so John just kind of made his way in and he sat down. And Reginald immediately said, "John, I know you did not kill Emma. That's why I'm here." John was so relieved, and before long, he was pouring out all the information he could about everything he could recall about the night of the fire and the murder. And as he did, Reginald took all these notes and he began creating a framework for John's defense. And so by the time John was back in his jail cell, he couldn't help but feel kind of optimistic that maybe with Reginald's help, he could actually beat this thing and prove he didn't do this. But John's relief would be short-lived. His first court appearance went extremely well. Reginald showed up in a fancy suit, and he was just completely on his game and just ripped the prosecution apart and basically said their entire case was just circumstantial, and he rattled off all these legal precedents, which John didn't really understand, but he looked up and saw the judge definitely knew these precedents and was impressed with what Reginald was doing. And then also Reginald would say that the police did a terrible job investigating. They basically didn't investigate and just jumped to conclusions that it was John. And so as Reginald is basically destroying the prosecution, Reginald looked over at the prosecutor and he could tell the prosecutor looked really nervous. And so John was really starting to feel confident that Reginald was exactly what he needed. But on the day of the second court appearance, Reginald just didn't show up. With no explanation, he didn't contact anybody, and so John just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen. The judge delayed for as long as he could, but eventually when, Reginald still didn't show up, the judge looked to John and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to defend yourself." Which, of course, John did not know how to do. I mean, he barely had even gone to school, let alone studied law. And from there, things only got worse for John. Reginald continued to miss court dates with no explanation, and then on other times he would show up to court, but instead of being this fantastic, very sharp lawyer, he kinda acted like a maniac. He would start all these unnecessary fights with the judge over totally irrelevant matters, like how to pronounce a particular word, and then when he had witnesses on the stand, his line of questioning didn't make any sense. He would ask things like, "Well, what did you have for breakfast today?" and "What's your favorite color?" And then finally, Reginald just withdrew altogether from the case, leaving John with no lawyer at all, which admittedly might have actually been an improvement for John. After Reginald withdrew, another lawyer found out about it and took pity on John and volunteered to take on the case. But it was on very short notice, and this other lawyer had good intentions, but was not nearly as skilled as Reginald was when he was kind of on his game on that first day. And so really quickly, this lawyer kind of fumbled the case, and then when it went to the jury to decide whether or not Reginald was guilty, it took them less than an hour to come back and say, "Oh yeah, he's guilty. He killed Emma." And so John was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, John sat in his jail cell waiting for his execution. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck, that trap door, it would not function whenever John was standing on it. Now, when John was moved off the trap door, it functioned perfectly fine. It was only when he was on that trap door that it would not work. And so think about this. Pretend you're John. 3 different times, the hangman led him onto that trapdoor. They put the noose around his neck, put a bag over his head, asked him for his last words, and they threw that lever, and each time John is expecting to die, and it's not working. Finally, after the 3rd failure, the hangman just called off the execution, and then actually a judge would weigh in and say, "You know what? We cannot possibly attempt for a 4th time to execute John. This constitutes cruel and unusual punishment," and so they swapped his sentence from a death sentence to 22 years in prison. And none of this would make any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma's murder, when John, by this point, was just sitting in a jail cell and everybody had forgotten about him. On that day in 1890, a group of very high society type people, politicians and lawyers and rich people, they all gathered in this misty cemetery not far from the Glen. The group was in the cemetery for the burial of a very important and well-respected man who had died after slowly going insane. And as the priest finished his final blessing, the mourners began chucking handfuls of dirt into the grave, and as they did, one of them said quietly but out loud, "Today we have buried a murderer." Here's what many people believe really happened on the night of November 15th, 1884, when Emma was killed. At the time of Emma's murder, Elizabeth's pregnancy was very scandalous, but not just for Elizabeth. It was also scandalous for the father of the baby. The father who nobody knew except for Elizabeth. And it was scandalous for this father because, like Elizabeth, he was worried what society would think if they found out he was having a baby out of wedlock, especially with Elizabeth, who basically from a societal standpoint was kind of below his station. But despite all that, the father of the baby did not attempt to distance himself from Elizabeth. Instead, on the night of the murder, the father of the baby actually decided to sneak into the Glen to see Elizabeth. But Emma was still awake. She was up late, drinking her hot cocoa, writing and reading, and she heard the sound of the father coming into her home. And so she got up to go investigate, and she would eventually find the father up in the hallway right outside of Elizabeth's bedroom. And remember, Emma is very traditional, she's very conservative and religious, and she's seeing this strange man in her house clearly going into or coming out of Elizabeth's room, and she was so offended and angry, and so Emma just began screaming at this guy to get out of her house, and if he didn't, she was going to tell the whole world about this illicit relationship. And then Emma walked up and hit this guy right in the face, and at this point, the father just snapped. And he flew into this rage and he began screaming back at Emma. And then he grabbed a hatchet that was on the wall right near the pantry. He pulled it off and he brought it down right on top of Emma's head. And Emma crumpled to the ground. And the man, he's looking down at Emma and he's realizing he's inflicted this horrific injury on Emma. And if she doesn't die, she's gonna tell someone. And then this father is gonna go to jail, if not worse. So, in a moment of panic, this father runs into the kitchen, gets a kitchen knife, comes back, and he finished Emma off. Once she was deceased, he dragged her back to the dining room where she normally did her reading and writing, and then he doused her and the whole house in that weird oil that he found in the pantry where John was sleeping, and after getting the whole house covered in it, he ignited it, and then he ran out of the house. But over the next 6 years, Emma's killer felt so bad about what he had done, both to Emma and then nearly killing Elizabeth and his unborn child, that he went completely insane, and this caused his physical health to totally fail, and he died. But right before he died, as he's laying in his deathbed, he began ranting and raving about all the things he regretted in his life, including murdering a woman at a big, beautiful seaside estate. Basically, he was admitting to killing Emma, and he did it in the company of all the people who would then be at his burial. And so that's why as they're throwing the dirt onto his casket, they're saying, "Today we buried a murderer." The killer's identity was none other than Reginald Templar, John's lawyer. Now, nobody knows if Reginald took John's case because he felt guilty and wanted to prevent an innocent man from going to jail, or if he just wanted to sabotage John's case to ensure he did go to jail to protect himself. We don't know. Either way, though, it was during the course of this trial that Reginald began his descent into madness, which would ultimately lead to his death. Some people believe the reason the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on that trapdoor and it wouldn't open was because of divine intervention. That God or a god or some deity came to earth and literally interfered with the execution to spare John's life. And the reason people think that is because, John really was an innocent man and he did not deserve to die. John would serve all 22 years of his sentence, and then when he got out, he became famous for being the man who could not be hanged. John would eventually get married, and he would move to America, where he would live a very happy and quiet life until he died at the age of 81.
Around 3 a.m. on September 5th, 1981, a woman drove through a housing development in Lakeland, Florida. She was with two of her friends who had agreed to spend the night with her at her duplex. And this was a huge relief to this woman, because yesterday there had actually been a violent murder in their neighborhood. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and hide open cans of tuna fish in all their vents, and then turn the heat on full blast. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before 8 p.m. on September 3rd, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton stood in her kitchen in Lakeland, Florida, staring into her cupboard. It was almost completely empty, except for a few cans of beans and a bag of flour. And seeing this gave Linda a pit in her stomach, because she knew she would somehow have to turn these sparse ingredients into a meal for her kids. Linda was a single mother of two boys, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And Linda didn't have very much money. And so in order to take care of her kids, she had to be resourceful. Like, finding a way to make food with whatever ingredients she had. And she also would make her kids their own clothing. Anything to save money. Now, up until a few weeks ago, the family had lived in Alabama. But Linda had moved to Lakeland specifically because she had a lot of family and support there. And so Linda had hoped that, because of that support, that, her and her son's lives would, improve quite a bit. It wouldn't feel like such a struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the move to Lakeland had just been more of the same. Linda couldn't find a steady job, so she and the boys had been relying on government assistance and food stamps, which never seemed to be enough to keep these two teenagers well fed. And tonight, Linda's youngest son, Tim, was about to be dropped off after being at football practice, and historically, he was very hungry after practice, and so she really wanted to have dinner ready for him. And on top of that, Linda was hopeful that Tim and her other son, Jeff, would eat fast enough that they would have enough time to make it to a neighbor's housewarming party later that night. So all the neighbors around Linda were basically as new as she was, since the complex they lived in had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was the sprawling development with about 80 one-story duplexes that were technically government-subsidized housing, but it felt more like classic suburbia, since the units were on cul-de-sacs with neat lawns where all the kids would go outside and play. Now, Linda's sister also lived in this complex, so Linda already knew at least one person. But to Linda, making friends of her own was also pretty important to her. She was an outgoing person by nature. And also, she was newly single and wanted to take her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Until recently, Linda had been dating this guy named Brendan Fowler, who had been great at first and was even the one who told her about this apartment complex. But he'd started to get really controlling and possessive, and just 2 days ago, Linda had finally ended things. But believe it or not, Linda actually felt sort of hopeful. She had believed that by leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this complex, that would sort of be the refresh that she and her kids desperately needed. But the truth was, it sort of seemed like actually the true reset had been the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. Like it all needed to happen, all this big change in order for their lives to really get on the right track. And so, feeling optimistic, Linda looked into the cupboard at her limited ingredients and suddenly realized she could actually do a quick bean casserole with just these couple of things. So she grabbed the cans and the flour, and she got started. About a half an hour later, Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen to see if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but they needed to wait for Tim to get home from football first. And when she said that, Jeff sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and there was basically no food in the house, and so he couldn't even eat anything else to tide himself over, like, come on, let me eat. Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad, but at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. I mean, Jeff had been talking back to her a lot lately, and the two of them seemed to fight all the time. Linda knew he was sort of just being a typical teenager, and he was really hungry, and so he's testing her limits. But she was just getting really sick of it. And so before she could even really think about it, she snapped back at him and said, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. And at that, Jeff literally stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Linda went to the window and watched her son pick up his bike and pedal off down the road. After that, Linda sighed and walked over to her phone and called her mom. She assumed, Jeff, her son, would go to her parents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up, Linda warned her that Jeff might be there soon and he'd likely want to eat. Her mom said that was fine, and they would drop him back off after dinner. Then, her mom said she actually was glad that Linda called, because another letter came. And as soon as Linda heard that, she felt this wave of anxiety come over her, because she knew what kind of letter she was talking about. So, Linda's ex-husband and Tim and Jeff's dad, Frank Slayton, lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they'd been divorced for 7 years. But Frank had never stopped harassing Linda after they broke up. And since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had been mailing threatening letters to Linda's parents, saying that Linda had ruined his life. And so now Linda was thinking, no matter how many fresh starts she started, that Frank was always going to screw them up. He was never going to go away. And so after taking a calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to read it. Not long after she hung up, her younger son, Tim, came in the front door. He was all sweaty and dirty from football practice, and right away, Linda asked him, hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home? And Tim said, yes, I did. So Linda, she didn't have a car because she couldn't afford one. And so Tim's coach always had to give him a ride, but Tim said, I thanked him like always. And so Linda told him to hurry up and eat because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim walked home from the party through the dark apartment complex. There were 7 other people who had been at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. Everybody just drank iced tea and played cards while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex, like the great business district across the street and how responsive the maintenance team was. So Linda was glad they went. She was also exhausted, and her sister always came over for coffee in the morning, so she needed to go to bed now or she would never wake up. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and opened up the door, Linda froze because there was already somebody inside. For a second, she thought it might be an intruder, but then she realized it was actually just her older son, Jeff, who had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a sort of "I'm sorry" expression on his face. Tim saw the situation and immediately disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and brother some space. Linda went to join Jeff in the kitchen, but Jeff didn't say anything. So Linda spoke first and reminded him that it was not good to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. And Linda knew from experience with her son, it was better not to force Jeff to talk. So she decided she would just give Jeff a minute, and she began washing the dishes. Finally, after a few moments, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom, and Linda smiled. She felt relieved they could just move on from this. She said it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight, and Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept, and then Linda wrapped up in the kitchen, turned off the lights, and headed into her own bedroom, closed the door, and she went to bed too. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up to Linda's duplex. They'd had coffee together every morning since they moved to the neighborhood, so Judy expected to knock on her sister's door and go right in like she always did. But this time after she knocked, nobody answered. So Judy waited and then knocked again. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and tried to open up the door, but she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out in response. But Judy wasn't really worried. She just assumed, that Linda must have overslept or something. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few minutes, and eventually she would call to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she walked away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's house. One of the back windows was missing a screen, and Judy knew that that particular room was Linda's bedroom, and it hadn't been like that yesterday. So seeing it now made her feel kind of uneasy, and so she went over to look inside. And when she looked inside, she saw her sister fast asleep in bed. And for a second, Judy was relieved, because this confirmed that this is all this was. Her sister had overslept, that's that. But then Judy realized there was something off about Linda, like the way she was positioned just seemed wrong. And when everything clicked for her, she staggered backwards and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on September 4th, 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers surrounded the duplex in a Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under some crime scene tape and headed to the home's walkway with a bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. So Pickett was actually just a year away from retirement after 2 decades as a detective, and for the last few years, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit, which meant he oversaw the collection and documentation of evidence at crime scenes. And so he wasn't the lead investigator on this case, but when it came to forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation and knew that this was very likely a homicide, and the victim had been identified as 31-year-old Linda Slayton. Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had asked a nearby maintenance worker to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responder got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep and appeared to have no idea their mother was deceased in the next room, which Pickett knew would give investigators somewhat of a timeline to start with. Linda was clearly awake when her kids went to sleep and must have died sometime during the night while her kids were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway, he passed by 2 teenage boys sitting in their pajamas on the ground. He assumed these must be the sons, and one of them just sort of stared ahead, seemingly in complete shock, while the other sort of sobbed into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if anybody had spoken to them yet, but he knew they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they'd know the habits and patterns of everybody who lived there, and might be able to tell him if anything seemed out of place. So Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators inside about that. Then he looked at the house and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of the crime scene before he did any actual collections. So before he would go in, he would walk around the entire house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the police first got there. And from what he could see, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and spent some time dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there, or any noticeable shoe impressions in the dirt outside. And then when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the officers and detectives that were already in there and went straight to the bedroom. And the first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed with a metal coat hanger wrapped around her throat. The sheets around her were covered in blood, and she was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up. And when Pickett got closer, he saw where the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches on Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her nails as she tried to pry the hanger away. He'd have to wait for the autopsy, but it was clear from her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also been likely sexually assaulted. Pickett stepped back and looked around the room, trying to decide where to start. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as possible. So the first thing he did was try and guess what happened and how the killer might have interacted with the crime scene. That way he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention. He figured the killer must have come in through the open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. Linda's purse and jewelry were still on the dresser, and the drawers were all closed as opposed to open and rifled through, so it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this likely was not a robbery gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done was come in through the window and attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any signs of a struggle. So Linda was likely caught off guard by a very fast attack and unable to really fight back quickly. Because if she did, the room would be a huge mess. But then Pickett caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed the clothes were all hanging on metal hangers that looked identical to the one that was around Linda's neck. And that's when it hit him. The killer must have at some point been in the closet, hiding. He supposed the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger once the attack started, but that would have taken too much time and also given Linda a chance to get off the bed or fight back or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It was much more likely that the killer had broken in earlier, hid in the closet, and then waited until Linda was in her bed asleep to come out and attack. If Pickett was right about that, this became definitely a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or had been watching her, since they would have known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear and began thinking how he was going to begin looking for evidence. He figured he would start at the window and spend some time there, and then he would go to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas. And so once he had that plan in mind, he went to the window and he began looking for evidence, and sure enough, after only a few minutes of dusting, he smiled. Because there, on the ledge, was a very clear, well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab, comparing two sets of prints with a magnifying glass. He'd been at it for hours already, so his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene yesterday, Pickett had gone back to the station to review the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the detectives to get an update on the case. And what they would tell him is they had spoken to the neighbors, as well as Linda's family, and they did have a few solid leads and a timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff got dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. And Tim, the younger son, and Linda had gotten back from a neighbor's party just after 11 p.m. They all went to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers heard anything until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene, that Linda's attack was very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or it would have woken up her sons. The autopsy report had also come in, and it confirmed Linda died from strangulation and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect semen from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a man here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners. She had her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and an ex-boyfriend named Brendan Fowler. Frank apparently had abused Linda when they were married and still sent her very threatening letters. And Brendan was apparently very possessive with a bad temper, and Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. And so some officers were already out looking for both of these men, and Pickett was eager to get both of their prints. But for now, Pickett was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their canvass initially, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were suspects. And so Pickett had collected fingerprints from all the men at that party who didn't have an alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, comparing those prints to the print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none were a match, but they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, and so Pickett would have to test those as well. So in 1981, DNA testing didn't exist yet, but investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those samples against the genetic material found on Linda's body and rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another reason for wanting to be diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, like in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors had called in to say a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was gone by the time the police arrived, they could see her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to say that the screen on their window was pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like Linda's, but the timing was very suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living in the complex. The department had ordered some patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about. So he was working with his radio right next to him. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty tired and would need a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing outside of an interrogation room, listening as some detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell by his voice that he was not happy to be here. He sounded argumentative and defensive as he insisted he really had nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the whole night. He even gave detectives his mom's phone number and said they should call her to confirm it. Pickett heard the detectives confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test and let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, yeah, go ahead. And as soon as Pickett heard that, based on experience, he went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind. On September 11th, so 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the newspaper. And what he saw made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he admitted they would not be making an arrest now or in the next few days. And reading that in print reminded Pickett of just how little they had in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill, and they'd tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but found that he was in Alabama on the night Linda was killed. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first because during his polygraph, the results had been inconclusive, and his alibi didn't check out. His family had said he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they all went to sleep and couldn't say for sure if maybe he left or not. But when Pickett had looked at his prints, he had no choice but to clear him, because they clearly were not a match. So now Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for leads, which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his paper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him, and it was Linda's own 15-year-old son, Jeff Slayton, and he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his mother's murder and had already been questioned a few times. Detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members mentioned that, Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot before she died. And when investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's room. So it was strange he hadn't heard anything on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that he and his mother's fights were not that serious, and they did fight the night she died, but it was over some dumb argument over what time dinner was. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked, because he wished he had so he could have gone in there and helped her. And also Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff. And Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid, because he thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own, and from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed sort of like typical teenage behavior, squabbling with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker broke in through the window, which didn't make sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he lifted from the window, and he knew it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, partner, or friend, which was why he assumed the detectives weren't pursuing it. But through his forensics, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everybody in Linda's life who had a motive or opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was very outgoing. Pickett thought it was possible the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed possible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave, he tried to go back to the newspaper, but he kept thinking about Linda. He'd been sure this case would be solved quickly by forensics, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed, and it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he left the precinct for the last time, he sort of had a pit in his stomach, because he had a feeling that without him, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and forgotten. Afternoon in the fall of 2001, so 2 decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, Detective Brad Grice sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department reading over Linda's cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grice had been sorting through the department's cold cases and choosing which ones to reopen. And this had been a really slow process, because he had to do that and juggle his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been working on Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much, since the whole reason this case appealed to him was because he was sure he could solve it quickly. Because it had DNA evidence. So back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through blood type. But now, in 2001, Bryce could use that same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did this, he wanted to familiarize himself with the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters around the time of her murder. And then her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, was known to have a bad temper and seemed very controlling of Linda. And they broke up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so somebody could have maybe followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been too, but Jeff actually admitted to getting in a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared through fingerprints, alibi, or polygraphs. But Grice knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those 3 things, DNA overrode that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He'd already decided that, basically no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the two people who'd known Linda better than anybody else. Her sons, Tim and Jeff. 2 days later, Grice walked into a meeting room at the precinct, where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting. And as soon as he saw the brothers, he just started laughing, because he realized he knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together for years, but it hadn't occurred to Grice that this Jeff was that Jeff. And Jeff recognized Grice at the same time. So they spent a while talking and laughing about what a crazy coincidence this was. And so when Grice finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim at the same time, Grice's first line of questioning was actually just pretty emotional. It just was like, hey, how are you guys holding up after this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood got pretty heavy as the two brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been. After their mother had been killed, they both said they were terrified that, they were going to get hurt too, because the killer was never caught. They felt like, who's next? Jeff said he slept with a knife under his pillow, and he eventually got so depressed, he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted he also struggled, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and friends for support and kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grice that, Tim and Jeff didn't really have any information he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about details of the case, Grice explained that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect samples from every person involved in this case, which included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then said, of course. So Grice stood up and said he would send a tech inside. But before he left, he promised them that he would find their mom's killer, and he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grice sat in front of a screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grice had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case from 1981. Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband Frank Slayton and her ex-boyfriend Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the blood samples that the original investigators got from Linda's neighbors, but none of them matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer, which was disappointing because it meant that Grice had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the case notes, he noticed the mention of break-ins around the complex shortly after Linda's murder, and it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person would not have just hurt Linda, they would have other victims too. So Grice had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases that, felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. So in 1982, a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Ulmer was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had this long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grice finished reading the report, he jumped up and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on Jimmy as he possibly could and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grice sat at his desk staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important call, one that would confirm whether Jimmy Ulmer was Linda's killer. After doing a background check on Jimmy, Grice had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex and was literally staying with them when Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy was not alive anymore, but they had gotten in touch with his mother, who gave them her DNA, which they were testing now. So this DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it would show if she was at least a relative to the killer. And as Grice waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding. Because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally made sense now. Jimmy was this violent serial home invader who had probably seen Linda while staying at his friend's house and maybe stalked her until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes to find more victims. Just then the phone rang and Grice picked it up and he could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other side. He was going to get an answer here. But just a second later, they told him it was not a match. Grice's stomach dropped, but he thanked them anyway, and he hung up. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grice kept pushing forward. As the months passed by, he would regularly find new suspects and eventually clear them. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database in case any new additions were, added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grice still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline, and he finally had to make the call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone and dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grice said he did need to retire, and he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into retirement, Grice sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep in an article when his cell phone rang. And when he looked at the ID, he was surprised to see it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He had not gotten a call from them in years, so he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grice was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on the DNA profile that Grice had ordered. And through that process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they did, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints did match the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grice sat up and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. That suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out, the killer had removed that screen from her bedroom window and crept inside. And then they had hid in this closet until she had come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now and finding ways to get close to her and her family. But Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded, and as they listened to Linda open her bedroom door and walk inside. And the killer continued to wait anxiously as they listened to the sound of Linda getting ready for bed and getting changed, and then eventually they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then after the killer was sure Linda was in bed, the lights are off, it's quiet in the room, they waited even longer just to make sure Linda was asleep and her children were asleep. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they grabbed a coat hanger off the hook in the closet and then burst out of the door. And then before Linda could do anything, make a sound, even react, she's totally caught off guard, the killer was on top of her and had wrapped the coat hanger around her throat. Linda struggled and clawed at her throat to try to get this thing off of her, but the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda, and then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was done, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through and wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life and would drive him to and from practice every day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently just developed a total fixation on his mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning out how and when to attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph was interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder, but he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, He just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice, and Tim would even very tragically begin to rely on Joseph for, emotional support, grieving the loss of his mother. But it's to her killer. He just didn't know. And then even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row in that picture. In December of 2019, Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery and was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. It was very festive. But as she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand, and she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks, and not because it was festive. It was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the Follow Button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest possible setting, then go ahead and just rip the thermostat out of the wall and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods leaned towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone, because she had to finish getting ready for her 7 o'clock shift at work. So Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job, and this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it. And because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well, and if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She'd gotten this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer. And she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could drive Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while, but these days they were just roommates, living together to split the bills. Although, secretly, Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David, and it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's third job of working at flash dancers, and he didn't judge her for it. And Catherine felt like a lot of people did, so she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met. Whether she was dating them or not, he just did not like them. Now, some of these guys, she could understand why David, didn't like them. Like there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly, who really she'd only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she'd only seen off and on, and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, you know what, I'm not going to figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed. And that's when she heard that dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate, David, walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked a ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building and he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. And he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second floor apartment and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog sitting. Somehow it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. And Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog, but he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it, and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird, so he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open, so he walked over to it, and he called out to her again. And then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her door open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped. And David felt resistance on the other side, like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David's starting to feel pretty worried. And so the surge of adrenaline came over him, and he just shoved the door open, and he stuck his head in, and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. Half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here. But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was in fact waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he reached the second floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene. And one of them was speaking to this young, skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment, and then he also looked at the door itself. But he didn't see any damage that could signify forced entry. So he stepped into the apartment, and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy. But it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. The futon was pulled out, and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people lived. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through. And when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open, and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place, and the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor, and that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then, in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so to Getz, right away, it seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the blocked door was making maneuvering in and out of this bedroom pretty difficult. So one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall, so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled that shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing, and then also there was a second identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe, and to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room, and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim, and Detective Getz' current number one suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murder had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen, and because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. That was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and drive Catherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected, because on the way, he had run into some of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb. But when he got there, there was no sign of her, and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment, and in the hallway he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after. And then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and that in that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped? It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder, because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating, and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her. But it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car. And Catherine had felt bad about that, so she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the futon out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page, because David was not just Catherine's roommate, he was her ex-boyfriend. An ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but right now, he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait, and Getz stood up to leave. But he stopped at the door, and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was. And without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down, and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team and the uniformed officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also, Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood, and he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time, Catherine was fine. But 2 neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units, but still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bedsheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5. And this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David a water. He just sat down and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building, and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Getz watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine, and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him completely unmoved, David launched into a whole news story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else. But he knew he did have to follow every lead, so he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." Inside, the article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it. And a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was. And it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city, because he intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads he had, to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size too. At a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands. And he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers, and he just wanted to help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they'd been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was. Paul said he actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up, and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. Months ago, he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten roofied during one of her strip club shifts. A roofie is called the date rape drug. It basically makes you incapacitated and effectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a roofie and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roofie. Catherine had cut off contact with Joe, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene, but she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. And Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so Getz jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone. Because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. And at this, Getz studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself. But it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here. And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he'd brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. And Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He had claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roofied anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now, Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer. But men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38, but there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad Stewart or anybody else for that matter had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they'd just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along. A bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they'd carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor, and that's when they found the handprint. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news, because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem, because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point, and they were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22, because he needed the suspect's prints in order to make the arrest, but he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press, and to a lot of people, it looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball here. But then on December 16th, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said led Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment 2D and reached down and turned the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off limits to the killer. And just thinking about that, the surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade. But the killer just forced their way past it, and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free. But she couldn't. And so they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought, and they slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage, and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that black dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge. They were still barking at the killer. And so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door, where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. And on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer, who was currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. They, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Getz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did in fact match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment, knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. One night in March of 2016, two friends sat on a couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit close to home, literally, because it was about a missing person who had vanished just miles away from where they lived. And so they're watching this show, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, one of the friends suddenly stood up and began pacing around the room, muttering to themselves. And when the other friend, who was still sitting on the couch watching this,
asked them what was wrong. They were not ready for the answer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the follow button a really nice, really expensive steak dinner. But make sure you first significantly dull their steak knife. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patrick Iswar hurried out the side door of a hospital in Sète, France, buttoning a fresh-collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto his scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patrick did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrick's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. And one day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrick's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patrick had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey Levay. But Patrick was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patrick had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past, but she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patrick had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patrick had said, sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrick's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrick would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrick pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrick and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrick's older brother, Mark Iswar, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrick was. Mark frowned because Patrick lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrick hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrick loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it, then he hung up and began calling Patrick's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried, because nobody had heard from Patrick since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start. Patrick's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrique's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrique's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrique, but they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrique anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrique's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrique's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrique's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrique would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind, all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Ferrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Set. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Verrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Set. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrique Issoire had disappeared after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrique. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrique just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked, where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrique anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrique had still not turned up. Since then, Patrique's brother, Mark, had been helping the investigation. Verrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrique like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Verrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrique. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Verrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrique was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrique's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrique went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrique there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrique had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrique's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrique's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrique into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrique. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrique had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad. But her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features,
But she definitely saw her father, Patrick, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be. But Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrick any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Chen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Set police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, he'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrick. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrick's divorce, Patrick had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Shen's wife, a woman named Nadege Shen, who had worked with Patrick at the hospital. Apparently, Nadege had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrick. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadege ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. And then the next day, Remy found Nadege in their garage hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Chen into an interrogation room at the Set police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So, right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrick Isouard. Now, this was a total bluff because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrick had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrick went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point, Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. 2 weeks had already passed since Patrick's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. Being the last person to see Patrick before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest, but Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot. So he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrique's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears and she was repeating over and over that Patrique had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here, since they had no body. I mean, who knows what really happened to Patrique at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns. And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patrique, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patrique Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrique's scooter had been abandoned. And so now Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere. So it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels. And just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrique's older brother, Marc, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case. Again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patrique. And so Verrier had hoped that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patrique had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patrique having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrique's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance. But so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck. And Verrier understood that Patrique's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Mark snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Mark had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety because Mark knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public. And if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out. And part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Mark wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patrick. Mark described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Set. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Mark's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spill out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Iswar on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Set, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. And they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened here. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded, and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles, and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn,
The killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do. Go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off. It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife. And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept his secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping. Note about our stories, they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Andrew Kelleher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballin podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballin YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.